Welcome back. Last time I was distinguishing between de jure segregation, segregation that's mandated or required by law, and de facto segregation, segregation that results from non-legal factors such as economic inequalities, people's racial attitudes, or the settlement patterns of people. De jure segregation is often referred to by another name, the era of Jim Crow. And the purpose of Jim Crow laws were to establish wholesale segregation of the South. A lot of people make the assumption that Jim Crow and segregation are the same thing. To me, Jim Crow has more than one dimension. Yes, there is no question that the main layer, and for some reason, and probably no one in their right mind would think of this, but I do. My mental image of Jim Crow is of a three-tiered or three-layered cake. The big base layer, of course, are the Jim Crow laws mandating legal segregation. But I believe there are two other components to Jim Crow. The second layer is political neutralization. Certainly, the 15th Amendment was threatening to white Southerners, and a variety of impediments to voting were put in place. And then the little layer is violence, intimidation, an attempt to bully and harass and to horrify a group of people into submission. And so I'm going to talk about all three of these elements of Jim Crow, but I'm going to spend by far the most time on Jim Crow legislation. There are only two Supreme Court cases related to segregation that I want you to know for exam purposes. The first are the civil rights cases of 1883. After the Civil War, there was a brief period of time where it looked like Congress may foster greater equity and equality. For example, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 had a critical provision in this particular case that outlawed discrimination in what we today call public accommodations, right? And so basically, the Congress could go in and could enforce its will in this particular case. Well, in this particular case, the Supreme Court, by an 8-1 margin, struck down, declared the Civil Rights Act of 1875 unconstitutional. Justice Bradley, who wrote the opinion in this particular case, said that the 13th Amendment could not be invoked as a ban on racial prejudice, and that if states were willing to ignore and tolerate discrimination, Congress could not legislate them to do so. So the critical provision that was struck down was the provision, and it was Provision 5, which prohibited discrimination in public places or public accommodations. Essentially, what the Supreme Court said in this particular case, besides the fact that the Civil Rights Act was unconstitutional, was that they were upholding the property rights of businessmen in this case. What the Supreme Court said in this case is that while the states cannot engage in active discrimination, if states wanted to ignore discrimination by private parties, the U.S. Congress could not intervene in that. The lone dissenter in this case was a legendary character, Justice Harlan, who's most famous for his eloquent dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson. But in this particular case, Justice Harlan writes a powerful dissent. In this particular case, Justice Harlan takes the view that railroads, hotels, restaurants, and theaters provide a public function. And in this particular case, Justice Harlan said that what the majority was doing was eviscerating the 14th Amendment of any meaning whatsoever. And so in this particular case, Justice Harlan was taking the national perspective that the Congress did have the right to intervene. that it was merely an enforcement mechanism of the 14th Amendment, and that the Supreme Court was eviscerating, or in essence taking all meaning away from that particular provision in the 14th Amendment. And of course, the result of the civil rights cases of 1883, the result of the Supreme Court ruling that private discrimination was legal, was that there was widespread segregation in the realm of public accommodations. And this was the law in the United States for 81 years until 1964. You may remember I told you when we were meeting face to face that as a young child, I participated in this evil. My grandmother took me and we ate at an all-white lunch counter. That was legal. It was repugnant and perhaps morally reprehensible, and yet that was the law. So even though the civil rights cases of 1883 does not get nearly the attention of Plessy versus Ferguson, it lasted a lot longer. As a legal principle, the civil rights cases of 1883 lasted 81 years. The precedent in Plessy versus Ferguson lasted less than 60. And yet, this is the one that if I were writing on the board, I would put the 10 stars next to. Plessy versus Ferguson. This is one of the most famous, some would say one of the most infamous cases in American history. In this particular case, Louisiana passed a law called the Separate Car Act of 1890, mandating separate but equal accommodations on trains or rail cars. This was challenged by a group using a man of mixed ancestry, Homer Plessy, who was 7/8 white and 1/8 black. And the reason for the challenge was, how can you have a separate rail car for black and white passengers when in fact you have a passenger who is both black and white? The group believed that the Supreme Court would not uphold the Separate Car Act, but they did. By an 8-1 margin, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld Louisiana's separate but equal doctrine on rail cars. And the result of this ruling goes way beyond just rail cars. If Plessy versus Ferguson was merely a case about segregation on trains, it would be an unfortunate case, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. What makes this case the end of the world is that when southern states saw that the Supreme Court was sympathetic to the notion of legalized segregation, or what I call de jure segregation, we began seeing this in virtually every aspect of public life. In 1899, Georgia, in the Cummings case, makes the claim that they can invoke separate but equal in public schools. And the Supreme Court, once again, 8-1, said that that was okay. When other states, including Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, started segregating other public places, like beaches and parks, and even down to the notion of public restrooms and drinking fountains, the Supreme Court, in case after case after case, accepted this new separate but equal doctrine. And so if the civil rights cases of 1883 legitimized private discrimination, Plessy versus Ferguson legitimized public discrimination. And now Jim Crow is anchored in two very powerful pillars. And so the result of these two cases in the late 19th century was that virtually every sphere of public life was segregated. Everything from parks, beaches, drinking fountains, restrooms, ice cream parlors, funeral parlors, cemeteries, and it goes on and on and on. The second component of Jim Crow was political neutralization. The 15th Amendment was very threatening to white Southerners, and as a result, they engaged in numerous forms of voter suppression. Your textbook discusses some of these mechanisms, including things like grandfather clauses, literacy tests, poll taxes, and the white-only primary was notorious in the state of Texas. To me, you don't need to know these devices. To me, as a political scientist, what I'm most interested in was, did these devices have a dramatic political impact? And the answer was absolutely yes. For example, if you follow along in your notes, if we look at the state of Louisiana, in 1896, there were 130,000 black men that were registered to vote in the state of Louisiana. That is an incredibly large and potentially powerful voting bloc. After the Supreme Court ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson, whites in Louisiana said the Supreme Court is sympathetic to us. They see the Constitution the way that we do. Louisiana rewrote its Constitution in 1898, allowing for many of these vehicles of what today we would call voter suppression. And the result was that in 1896 there were 130,000 black men registered to vote, but when the next presidential election rolled around in 1900, there were only about 5,000 black men that were still registered to vote. And by 1916, the number of black men registered to vote in Louisiana had declined to 1,772. And so if your motivation is to suppress black men from voting, these mechanisms in Louisiana had a success rate of about 98.5%. The result of this political neutralization was that black political leadership disappeared in the South. We do not begin to see black locally elected officials in the southern United States until after the adoption of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And in the early 1970s, finally, for the first time in a century, we see black locally elected leaders in the South. So the first component of Jim Crow was segregation, and we see that in two cases, the civil rights cases of 1883 and Plessy versus Ferguson. The second component of Jim Crow was political neutralization and voter suppression, which was very widespread. And the third and the last component of Jim Crow was violence, intimidation, widespread lynchings. And one thing that bothers me a little bit sometimes when I read textbooks is that the textbooks often make it sound like the KKK is really the only thing wrong in the South. That if the Ku Klux Klan did not exist, and remember, I have no love for the Ku Klux Klan. I was roughed up by two Klansmen in 1975. But in this particular case, what we have is a situation where racism was far deeper rooted in Southern society than just the effects of this one hate group. There was widespread attempts to intimidate and hassle black voters from flexing their political muscle, black people demanding or exercising their freedoms and rights. And it was really a very nasty situation. So when you put Jim Crow together, you have a great evil. And I don't use the term evil very often. I usually use the term that it was bad, it was unfortunate. But sometimes you've got to call out evil. So Nazi Germany was evil. But so too was Jim Crow in the South. We have a situation where a whole group of people were victimized by the law, were victimized by being denied basic civil rights such as voting, by being hassled, beaten up, in many cases lynched, and a variety of other things. This was really a great evil. And something this evil is going to generate a very powerful response. And so in the next mini lecture, I want to talk about how there was a powerful response to Jim Crow, a very powerful legal remedy, and then a civil rights act.